Hi, I'm Michael Lewis.
Hi, I'm Drew Temple.
And I'm Bo Fraley. And today we're going to talk about ExxonMobil. We're going to give you a background of the company, and then we're going to talk about the two primary investigations the SEC is undergoing right now. We're going to talk about what we determined after doing our research and whether or not we think the SEC is correct in their investigations or not, and then we'll give you a brief conclusion as to our final thoughts.
Exxon and Mobil were merged in 1999 and are currently the largest successor of the Standard Oil Company. They are currently the 8th largest company by revenue, and they are headquartered in Irving, Texas, and currently being audited by PricewaterhouseCoopers.
And the two big issues the SEC is investigating first comes with climate change, how Exxon is planning for the future events in this, especially due with the carbon tax, and then how they're impairing their assets, because Exxon is currently the only oil and natural gas company that is not impairing their assets for commodity prices.
It is often big news when the SEC is conducting a formal investigation on a company, as they currently are with ExxonMobil. The SEC requires a majority vote of all commissioners prior to launching a formal investigation, and former SEC Commissioner Beavis Longstreth stated that there is likely probable cause that ExxonMobil has broken accounting regulations. Otherwise, the SEC most likely would not have gone forward with a formal investigation. This investigation uncovered that in 1970, Exxon conducted research that connected a link between greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And however, in 1980, the way they ran their business highly contradicted with what their research concluded in the 1970s. Throughout the 1980s and to today, they have strongly been against domestic and international policy making in regards to climate change regulation, and currently don't believe that their company is affected by these climate changes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start, but you have to kind of factor in the fact that these studies and discussions happened back in the 70s and 80s, and the oil and natural gas industry is just different today, especially with prices falling recently, and the fact that the Obama's administration is trying to push for a carbon tax, and a carbon tax is a tax on CO2 emissions, so that's really going to affect a lot of companies, but especially oil and natural gas companies. And so while in the past there may have not been a way to directly relate costs from climate change to your financial statements, with these potential taxes and other regulations, there's kind of a clearer line from climate change to your financial statements.
That's true, but kind of in defense for Exxon, in their 10K, they list out several different factors as to why they would do impairment testing. And one of those says basically if there's any potential trigger of impairment due to a significant change in legal factors. And so yes, having a carbon tax is definitely a change in the legal factors and something they're going to have to account for. They might not believe it's going to be a significant change. One, most of their assets are natural gas, and so probably coal companies need to be a little bit more worried about the carbon tax than natural gas, but it's still something to be weary of. At the same time, Australia implemented a carbon tax in 2010, and by 2012 it was already repealed. And so I think they could also be looking at that and saying, this might be very difficult to implement and be successful, so we probably shouldn't be too worried about accounting for it at this time. And then Drew, in defense of the research, there's an article posted in basically kind of a journal that ExxonMobil publishes. The author of this particular article is Brian Flannery, and he basically says the idea that man might be able to change the atmosphere enough is reasonable, could be reasonable, but at the same time it could be ridiculous, and that they just didn't have enough evidence at that time to conclusively decide. He went on to say that the data they had at the time was incomplete, and so I mean today there might be more conclusive evidence, but I still don't think there's necessarily enough to absolutely say 100% what you are doing is absolutely changing it, and it's completely due to this. I think so. Basically, they kind of have a defense and say, this is a disclaimer of we did do research that supports this, but at the same time, we can't know for sure. Which that kind of takes me on to my next point. If you remember how the American Petroleum Institute, they use freedom of speech as a defense as to why they shouldn't have to report how much they're giving to foreign governments, or how much foreign governments are giving to them. And they use freedom of speech and saying, hey, like, we don't need to say this, like this could harm us. And I think you could easily take that for these oil and gas companies to say, hey, like, we can't be held liable for something we said 40 years ago in research whenever they even made a disclaimer and said this might not be 100% accurate. And so by continually doing this, this quote by the Vice President of Public and Government Affairs, she basically says if they're going to hold us liable for quotes like this, it's going to limit research, not just in Exxon, but anywhere. Everyone's going to be afraid to go after these bold new discoveries and making these bold new claims because they're going to come back 20 years later and say, oh, like, you found evidence that supported this, but you didn't account for it now or that moment on. And so I think you could really, really hurt research from these companies. I think what they need to do is say, hey, scientists, researchers, keep doing your thing, keep trying to make discoveries and find this new stuff. Accountants, you keep doing your thing, how the company wants to handle it. Don't mix the accounting with the scientific stuff and say, accountants, you have to take in consideration what thousands of different scientists are saying and which ones you think is correct. You need to do what the company wants you to do, not what the scientists want you to do.
And I think it's also important to remember the SEC is basing this off policies like carbon tax, if they will or are reasonably likely to be enacted. So whether you can prove climate change or not is kind of irrelevant if the government's going to issue a carbon tax. Mm-hmm. You're going to have to pay that whether you believe in it or not because it's a government regulation. So the SEC is just trying to be fair, and you have to account for something like that.
Exxon argues that they've been consistent with their conservative approach in evaluating their new assets and their new fields and new wells. In their 2015 disclosure, they have shown that they have conducted impairment tests on the riskiest assets and that they are currently comfortable with the amount of risk placed on these assets. With the impairment tests coming far after the downfall in the industry, it really shows that the Exxon is confident and has faith in their assets, and that in the future these assets will be a great benefit to their company. The SEC is currently arguing that Exxon is not being transparent with their investors on how these impairments might affect their company.
You can make that argument. At the same time, you could argue that they are being transparent. 2013, 2014, 2015, no impairments shows a little bit of consistency. They're saying, hey, look, we're not going to change just because everyone else is. We are going to evaluate our assets. We are going to look at the risk on it. And then just because they've decided, hey, we don't think it's risky enough to change it. They're conservative in how they price things in the first place, and how they value things. And so I think that conservatism really allows them to maybe get a little bit of a benefit of the doubt in the situation that, hey, we are accounting for it. We're not just ignoring it altogether. We just don't think it's worth it right now.
And just to kind of go off the consistency point, we can take a look at their financial statements. And before we go into that, here are some industry comparisons as far as impairment goes. This is Chevron. This is from Chevron's 10K. And this is their depreciation and depletion account. And that's where a lot of companies put their impairment losses. And as you can see down here at the very bottom, for 2015, or from 2013 to 2015, they had an increase in $7 billion in expenses. And then if you check their note down here, they had impairments of $4 billion in 2015 and over $1 billion in 2014. So that's showing like these impairments are huge items for their expenses on their income statements. This is ExxonMobil's, as Bo and Drew were talking about, their consistency. From 2013 to 2015, their depreciation and depletion expenses really haven't increased from $17 billion in 2013 to $18 billion in 2015, and that could just be explained by inflation or something like that. This is another company, Shell. I thought it was important to include them because they have similar numbers to Exxon. And as you can see down here with their depreciation depletion account, they had impairment losses of over $9 billion in 2015 for their total company. And so we see that effect compared to Exxon not doing that. Mm-hmm. Here are just a kind of snapshot from their income statements that we pulled out. You can see revenues are really similar, 450 for Shell in 2013, 440 for Exxon, really similar. all the way to 2015 with their revenues going down because of oil and gas prices. Their total expenses, you can see from 2013 to 2014, they both lost around $20 billion, or their expenses, they lowered their expenses by $20 billion. But if you look in 2015, there's a clear difference. Exxon has about
114, 115.
Yeah, and then Shell has over 130, and you can really attribute that to, if you go into their depreciation account, you can see a big, as we said, Exxon very consistent, 17 to 18 billion, but Shell, they go 21 to 24 to 26, and as we showed earlier, those are from the big impairments. So if you were just looking at their financial statements and you didn't know anything about impairments, you would assume Exxon is the better company, that they handle their expenses much better than Shell, when that may not actually be the case.
Definitely. How do you guys feel about, is it necessarily fair for oil and gas companies to have to make write-downs on their reserves with the industry being so volatile? Impairment is supposed to take place when the book value of an asset drops below the recoverable value, and I think with the oil and gas industry, throughout history, the industry has gone up and down and up and down, and it's kind of unfair to have a company write down their assets when tomorrow the industry could turn around and then all of a sudden these assets are once again well above that recoverable. The recoverable amount is way above their book value. And the issue with that is that while the SEC may force them to write down these assets, they would not allow them to record a upward revalue, a gain essentially, when the industry does turn around and these assets are once again worth a lot more.
I would just argue that everyone in the industry has to deal with this, and when Exxon's the only one who doesn't, you can see from the financial statements, it's going to lower their expenses, where other companies can have increased expenses. So
my one defense to that is, once again, kind of this consistency thing. Like ExxonMobil in their 10K, they recognize, they could have these impairments, but they say here, should increases in long-term prices not materialize, certain of the corporation's assets will be at risk for impairment. So they recognize if these prices stay here forever, they're going to have to face this impairment. But they say, due to the inherent difficulty in predicting future commodity prices and the relationship between industry prices and costs, it is not practical to reasonably estimate a range of potential future impairments related to the corporation's long-lived assets. And so they're basically saying, we're being consistent. We're going to do what we think is right, and if there's the prices fluctuate back up, then our assets it's going to be the same. Versus everyone else has these impairments, it's going to be a lot bigger of a struggle for them, and it might make it harder for investors to truly see the value of those companies. And they think their value is, they think they're being transparent by showing what they truly believe is the value of the company.
And I would kind of argue against that. The SEC's job is to kind of protect investors, and I think by allowing Exxon to be the only company that doesn't have to include impairment, I feel like that's applying unnecessary risk to investors.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, an investor is going to be educated about the industry before he's investing money, but so the risk may not be that high as far as mismanaging money, but I think there's an unnecessary risk, and if you can get rid of that, you should.
But are the investors really that involved? It seems like most of this, the SEC is kind of saying, hey, you're the only one doing that. It kind of raises some concerns. We're going to come investigate you. Are the investors that worried, or?
I think that's a good point that SEC is not mentioning that investors all over are worried, but it is important to know that over 400 issues that were raised to companies that they should bring up with their shareholders, 100 were based in how they were accounting for climate change for oil and natural gas companies. And then a third of those went to Exxon, or 60 went to ExxonMobil, and a third of those were shut down at the door, and then the rest were voted out.
Mm-hmm.
So while maybe not a giant chunk of investors are concerned about this, there's clear investor concern for climate change.
Okay.
Do y'all agree with the argument, however, that it's not necessarily the Exxon's job to protect their shareholders from the risk, however, it's more of their job to make their shareholders money. I think it could be argued that it's the investor's responsibility to understand what is currently happening with the oil and gas industry and understand the risk that they have by investing in the industry. If they've been consistent with their financial statements throughout the time and they're disclosing everything, I think it's definitely agreeable that it's not necessarily their job to protect them from the rest cover. It's more their job to make the money, and they're doing everything they can to do that as of now.
So, I mean, the whole SEC versus Exxon, I don't necessarily think it's a accounting fraud. I don't think necessarily that anyone's going to say, you know, Exxon's committing fraud right now. I think it's more of an issue of this transparency of, you know, SEC doesn't think they're being transparent, but Exxon does think they're transparent. And so I think it's very subjective, it's deciding who is right or wrong in the situation versus just kind of the opinions of it. And so I think it's really difficult to say, you know, we think one company's going to win this and one company's going to lose it. I think it's very subjective and difficult to say. I don't know. I mean,
yeah, I think if they're not committing any accounting fraud, that Exxon definitely feels that as if they're being targeted by the SEC, and that just because they're not conforming to a so-called standard, as long as they're within their rights and not committing any fraud, that they feel like they're being targeted since they're one of the major oil and gas companies, and that by the SEC targeting Exxon, that they're kind of making an example of Exxon and trying to implement fear within smaller companies that may be committing the same accounting practices as Exxon, and they are trying. SEC is trying to get all companies to conform to what most other major oil and gas companies are doing right now.
Yeah, and I'd agree with a lot of what you guys said, Bo, about the impairment. I think Exxon raises some valid points about it's a volatile industry and constantly impairing assets maybe not give investors the best snapshot of how a company's doing. And Drew, the fact that it is the company's job to get as much wealth to the shareholders, and this is one way to do it, but I would argue that it's the SEC's job to make sure the financial statements are giving the best snapshot of a company. And then companies are required, yes, to get the most money to the shareholders, but to do it within the rules. And I think there needs to be a standardization in the industry, so you're not having to kind of go through financial statements and decipher, is this truly how well a company's doing?
And I think overall, Michael, Bo, and I, in a brief conclusion, we all agree that while Exxon is currently not committing any fraud and they're accounting properly, that SEC definitely has a definite right to be skeptical of their current accounting practices. Thank you.
Thank you.
that's good. I don't think it'll be too difficult to edit out my little blip
We'll just
there.
have to see if